Everyone has heard of King John, the tyrant forced to go to war with his barons, leading to the signing of the Magna Carta. People probably know him from Robin Hood or other Hollywood productions. But I'm not here to delve into the realms of mythology, hearsay or legend. My mission is to unveil the man behind the myth. Who was King John? King John has finally united all the princes of Wales against him. Led by Llewellyn the Great, the Welsh armies are rampaging through Norman land, taking swathes of territory, no doubt putting an end to John's invasion of France and hopes to reclaim the continent. John's only just put down an uprising in Scotland, where he is currently heading to the south. He covers the 150 miles from Durham to Nottingham in just 8 days. He sends letters to the Falcon, Fawkes de Brew, the controversial soldier, who was already in South Wales. John wants to know numbers and what he's up against. It wasn't looking good. Bugger France. Philip would have to wait. Wales needed to be taught a lesson. 30 shires were contacted. A vast army of labour was to be raised. Every kind of tradie, from builders to carpenters, diggers, anyone good in a siege. He raised almost 9,000 of them. Markets were shut down to keep logistics for the army. Once again, John's rage was unleashed. Wales was about to feel the full brunt of his fury. He wanted new castles built that would mark the permanent conquest of Wales. For all the unbelievers, his effort was double the size of his grandson Edward in his effort 70 years later. This new muster was to be assembled at Chester on the 19th of August, including the Scots, whose forces have so far abandoned John. But the king learns that Robert Vipon was beleaguered at Mathrafel, fighting impossible odds. His capture was inevitable. So without second thought, John sends his forces post-haste from Nottingham. He's in Bristol in no time, then Winchester, plundering treasuries to pay his men, before smashing his might into the Welsh border, scattering the Welsh at Mathrafel and relieving the garrison. But this daring move was not to invade further. It was to rescue a friend, Robert Vipon. So as the king retreated back to Nottingham, the main army not having reached Chester, the castle was destroyed. Unfortunately, Vipon had a hostage of his own, the 7-year-old son of a Welsh rebel lord. Vipon hanged the child by the neck until dead. When John reached Nottingham on the 14th of August, he postpones his feast to gather all of the 28 hostages of Llewellyn the Great's household, men, women and children. Every one of them were hanged. John's off his rocker. That done, the king retires to his solar and begins his meal. While here, according to the Chronicles, the king receives 2 letters, one from William of the Scots, the other from his daughter Joan, wife of Llewellyn. Both warned this paranoid king that traitors wanted to deliver him to his enemies. He'd been marked for destruction. A conspiracy had been hatched to overthrow and replace him. And as an excommunicated man, he was fair game. There was nothing he could legally do. His paranoia was now forefront of his already troubled mind. Paranoia would be an understatement. His 4-year-old son, Henry, had been given full security in case someone took retribution on the child. His invasion of Wales, John's, not Henry's, was cancelled. He disbanded the army. All John did to punish the Welsh, after all this effort, was to send 18 galleys to raid the North Welsh coast. This conspiracy was no secret, as rumours could be found everywhere. Some suspected that the French magnate, a crusader, Simon de Montfort, would take the throne. How prophetic, as Simon's son would try to do just that years later. Even a plot from the Marshal in Leinster? Fortunately, this is the one rumour John did not believe. In fact, the Marshal had convinced 20 Irish barons to openly renew their allegiance, vowing to return to England to help the king. Later, John would personally thank the Earl. But for now, the aged knight was better positioned in Ireland, supporting John de Grey, the Justiciar. The rumour mill was out of control, nasty lies, horrid lies, no different than a 1970s tabloid. Marlborough Castle had apparently been pillaged and burned, the treasury at Bristol looted by the Welsh, Queen Isabella of Angoulême was raped on the stone floor of Marlborough Castle, and Richard, her toddling son, put to death. Terrible lies. The only real event was a fire that tore through London. According to Wendover, this year, the Church of St Mary in Southwark and the Bridge of London between the three pillars was burned, and the chapel on the Bridge of London and all the buildings that stood on the bridge itself, and the bridge was greatly deteriorated, and the greatest part of Southwark was burned, and that by fire, crossing the Thames, the greatest part of the Londoners, that is to say both the city and the suburbs, with men, women and children, with the numbers to 3,000, was burned on the night of the translation of St Benedict, that is, the 11th day of July. A terrible disaster. Many people died, but this was August, and John, out of paranoia, has retreated into hiding. The king began relying on the one demographic that had proven loyal: mercenaries, especially Anglars de Signe. His loyalty was round and shiny, and John had a lot of it. John suspected everybody of this plot, demanding hostages, although, given what he did with the Welsh, people weren't buying it. The aging Robert Fitzwater of Essex flees to France. He had been loyal to John all these years, fought alongside the king in France and Ireland. They were about the same age, more or less, but John allegedly has seduced his daughter. Robert might want revenge? True or not, John wasn't taking any chances. There were apparently several reasons why Fitzwalter would betray John. All part of the early 13th century rumour mill that John was all too willing to listen to. Eustace de Vesey was also a target of John's paranoia, yet, unlike Fitzwater, Eustace had absolutely no motive. Okay, maybe Sir John seduced his wife, possibly, but that rumour came around years later and was not contemporary to this time. Possibly chroniclers trying to add context to what was otherwise a mystery. Eustace flees to Scotland to his old friend, the elderly King William the Lion, the King of Scotland. Were they both innocent? We may never know. John was pointing the finger at everyone, to be fair, including Richard of Umfraville, who handed over 4 sons as hostages. And there were others, but I'm not here to create long lists. We all get the picture. All suspects were apparently connected, and John was at his worst. Okay, so let's delve into a good old 13th century conspiracy theory, shall we?
Right, hear me out. William the Lion had always wanted Northumbria. We've seen this in previous videos. Something John was very well aware of. No, not my videos, the plot of Northumbria. Now, the suspects John was singling out all had connections to Northumbria. All of them had a dog in the race, you know? And now, Eustace de Vesey, also married to the Scottish king's illegitimate daughter, he flees to Scotland, along with some others. Okay, let's go further. Let's chase this rabbit. When John was on the border of Scotland, right, Alexander got back with his father, and the Scots are no longer playing ball with a hostage situation. Suddenly there's a Welsh uprising before John can react. All a bit suspicious. Okay, it actually gets deeper than this. Could the Welsh be part of the conspiracy? After all, Llewellyn was in John's court at Easter. Could have made friends? Could have put the word in people's ear? The Welsh were in contact with, can you guess? Philip Augustus of France. Hands up who's surprised. And that's a fact. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's fact. This could possibly be a very well organised plot. And Philip of France was possibly behind the whole thing, including the De Lacy rebellion in Ireland, and he was certainly in contact with William of Scots in previous years. Could Philip be the mastermind behind all of this? Either way, John certainly believed this. He was paranoid to the core. He spent a week holed up in Nottingham Castle, awaiting his mercenaries, before moving into Kingshull for 5 days. John gave charge of Northumbria to Philip of Oldcoats, a William de Warenne. By late August, they had overtaken Eustace de Vesey's estates, including his family castle. By the 3rd of September, John, somewhat less paranoid now, had arrived in Durham with his foreign mercenaries. And while in Pontefract, on his way to Durham, John was going to meet a man that could change his life. A prophet named Peter. Basically, John had heard another nasty rumour. This time true. Peter of Pontefract, or Wakefield, history gives him a few names, has seen the death of the king. On Ascension Day, on the 14th year of his coronation, John's rule would end, and the crown would pass to another. This wild prophecy was doing the rounds up north. Probably just a poor old man suffering from mental illness, or a con artist, or an attention seeker. It didn't matter a thing, but John took it seriously, very seriously. Peter is dragged before the king and told to elaborate, which he promptly does. He goes hog wild. He's dragged off in chains. If his prophecy is right, he'd go free. If not, he'll die, along with his son. Now we have a medieval Streisand effect, because no one really heard this alleged prophecy. No one had heard of Peter of Pontefract or Wakefield or whatever. Only local ears. Not anymore, it went viral. Even Wendover mentioned it, hence we hear of it. John's plans to shut it down had utterly backfired. But it did make him think. He began to be less harsh. He really had been a tyrant. The magnates, the church, the Jews, de Broas. For John, this was a real come-to-Jesus moment.
He begins by laxing his rules on the royal forests.
He begins mending relationships with the magnates, including the elderly William Marshal, who once again swore loyalty to the crown. At this point, his son, technically a hostage, more of a foster, was living with the king. He lived a high life. Even in military retirement, the old knight had sway. The Marshal convinced many to swear loyalty, pleasing the king. All John asked was the Marshal in Ireland to distribute a letter debunking a rumour that was floating about that the king had already been deposed. John wanted to reinforce he had not in fact been deposed and was still king. In return, William Marshal asks one favour from the king: make peace with Innocent III, the Pope. End this interdict, this purgatory. Let's hear the church bells ring again. So, in the summer of 1212, all loyal magnates were at John's court, working out a solution to this. Summer turns to winter, and King John capitulated, sending envoys to Rome. He would submit fealty to the Pope. All the while, Stephen Langton was in Rome with all the self-exiled bishops, putting their case to the Pope. For John, this wasn't going to be as easy as simply grovelling. They would make him sweat. Until then, the king would enjoy a meagre Christmas feast. Well, meagre for John, he's still king. Obviously this was a lavish banquet, just not as lavish as his previous banquets. Just with his minier and not his magnates, just his household gods. Early 1213, John was back up north fixing things with his northern subjects, even removing a highly oppressive sheriff, Hugh de Neville. Back down south, he does similar. Of course there's a catch. John hadn't given up on France. He still wanted his continental lands back. He was already in talks with the excommunicated king of Germany, Otto, a joint invasion of France. He could still pull this off. Ireland was secure. Llewellyn was busy in Wales, too busy to pose a threat to John. And William of Scotland had never posed a threat in the first place. So by March 1213, he mustered again at Portsmouth. Though, like before, days before the muster, he himself belays the order. Why? The king does seem to act erratic around this period in time. He travels from Hampshire to London to talk with the Count of Holland. Again, why? In April, John was making more foreign deals to counter France. He's on the defensive, is John. And not without reason, as Philip Augustus holds a council at Soden less than a week earlier. He was planning to install his own son, Louis, as England's ruler. The French were to assemble for an invasion in late April, a grand invasion. So John's now in Rochester, in Kent, preparing for this French threat. He wants everyone loyal, from magnates to freemen to bear arms. All who didn't heed the call were cowards. April 21st, Dover. That's the plan. And again, John had a massive army. He's good at getting these armies, he's just not good at using them. But he didn't plan on sitting back and waiting for Philip to make the first move. No, he'd strike first. John sent the fleet to France, raiding the French coast, causing havoc, before returning to the Sussex port of Winchelsea. On the 4th of May, John was at Dover again. He had amassed a vast host. Many even turned up without weapons and thus were dismissed. Others were stationed at Ipswich and Faversham, nervously awaiting the invasion. The rest of the army were at Barham with John. John de Grey was there, the Bishop of Norwich and Justiciar of Ireland. William Marshal had travelled with them, getting Ranulph de Blondeville on the way as they went. But despite all this, Philip Augustus had amassed 15,000 men, dwarfing John's effort. John's and the hearts of all who gathered must have sunk. The prophecy of Peter of Pontefract, fresh in their minds, the king will die, and the crown will pass. To who? Louis of France? Certainly not Henry, the heir. He's but 5 years old. And the date of the prophecy was imminent, 23rd of May, 1213, only a few weeks from now. Hurry up and wait. The whole of England waited, holding their breath. Behold, a ship, a single ship, and on that ship are Pandulf and Darren, along with the envoys John sent to Rome. They had stopped in France, saw the imminent invasion. For several days, Pandulf and Darren went to and fro across the Channel, England and France, eventually bringing terms of peace from the papacy. Salvation in the eyes of the church would nullify Philip's invasion. It would make it illegal. All John had to do to stop the French invasion is submit to Pope Innocent III, well, at least his envoys, Pandulf and Darren. John decides to bring it up a step. Fealty? He chooses penance, much like his father over the death of Thomas Becket. John had racked up a lot of sins. At the House of Templars in Dover, in front of the legate and a host of magnates, John gave up his crown, resigning as king effectively, atoning for his sins. He, for a brief moment, was just a humble man submitting to God Almighty. Of course the crown was handed back, he's still king. He knew this.
But he wasn't getting off that easily. John would pay the papacy 1,000 marks a year, and England would become a papal fief. John was a prodigal son returned. He was the Pope's golden boy. Despite all the bad John was doing behind the scenes, all he needed to do was to submit to the papacy once in a while. He is presented with a golden charter, still kept to this day in the papal archives. There you go.
It was controversial to say the least, but at least in the eyes of the Pope, this was perfect. Pandulf races across the Channel, telling Philip Augustus that his invasion is unjust and should cease. If Philip persisted, he himself would be excommunicated. Needless to say, the invasion ceased, and all those nervous souls could return home. And the bells rung again. The interdict was lifted. Purgatory dismissed by the light. It was time for a celebration.
But the king still remained under excommunication, according to Wendover. Do remember, it is not an on-off switch. There are degrees. The interdict may have been lifted, and John might be back in the good books, but there are nuances to this. There are other factors, like Stephen Langton still not being Archbishop of Canterbury like he should be. But at least the interdict is lifted.
On Ascension Day, in defiance of the prophecy that gave him so much fear, John erected a tent in Yule. Dover, not the one in Surrey, and invited all to join him. Bishops, nobles, and they feasted on everything they could in defiance of this prophecy. Chickens, John choked on no bones. He loved lamprey. Everything. This was lavish. A week later, John was still alive, and Peter of Pontefract or Wakefield or whatever was looking a bit of a knob, along with all his believers. But at least John kept his promise. The prophecy was failed, Peter was released from his prison and hanged. To make sure his lineage would not continue, his son was hanged with him. Then, as if by providence, a miracle. Philip of France was vexed and livid. He did not like any of this. He takes out his vengeance on Flanders. After all, the Count of Holland had allied with John. But John still has his fleet. The army may have gone home, but the ships are still there. When John hears of this news of the French up in Flanders, he sends his fleet to counterstrike, under the command of William Longspee, the Earl of Salisbury.
Longspee found the entire French fleet beached at the harbour at Dam. 1,700 galleys and cogs. Savary de Moulin was in charge of this mammoth effort. However, he was off pillaging the countryside. The fleet was unsupervised. Initially, the Earl of Salisbury thought it was the Flemish, but quickly realised what was unfolding. And even though Longspee was outnumbered at least 3-1, the English only having around 500 ships, the French had been caught trousers down. It would be rude not to engage. The Earl attacked swiftly, slamming into the fleet, scattering the surprised French. It was a stunning victory. Hundreds of French ships taken out of action. This was a victory of legendary proportions. Philip Augustus was nearby. He was besieging Ghent. When he hears of this disaster, he breaks the siege. He heads straight for the harbour. The English were looting his ships almost at will. Philip is forced to burn the rest of his fleet to prevent them being captured by the English. Never since the days of King Arthur had so much loot come from France. Philip would get his coin back, mark his words, but only by looting Flanders. The Earl of Salisbury was long gone, along with any talk of a French invasion. John wants to follow this up with a killing blow. He was still friends with the still excommunicated King of the Romans, the Holy Roman Emperor Otto, as well as the also excommunicated Raymond of Toulouse. Even the King of Aragon, Peter II, who was already proving himself formidable after defeating a Muslim army at Las Navas. The table on Philip had turned. Of course, an invasion into France was controversial, but since when has controversy ever stopped John? The problem is the barons. They're not quite so enthusiastic as the king. By June, John is trying another muster at Portsmouth, but he doesn't get anywhere near the numbers expected. Knights just were not coming, which meant, once again, the fleet doesn't set sail. Wendover claims it's because John is still under excommunication. Remember, Stephen Langton is still not Archbishop. John had grovelled, he'd begged. The interdict had been lifted, but after 5 years of sheer stubbornness, and despite the Pope's wishes, Stephen Langton was still not installed as the Archbishop of Canterbury. As I said before, John had one job. This final part was about to change.